Hello everyone. Hope I am live and hope I am audible to all of you. And today, this is my first live class with you through YouTube. Before this, we did our classes via Google Meet, via Zoom, via Skype, and other platform. And finally, we are on Google Meet. We are on YouTube. I know that all of you are facing a series of difficulties joining live classes right now due to family emergencies. All of you are facing a very difficult time, going through a very difficult time, and that's why I have shifted my pedagogy to YouTube for the time being so that it remains recorded for all of you. Whenever you want to listen to this lecture, you can hear this. So there is no compulsion of listening to these lectures live. But if you want to listen to these lectures live, you can obviously do that. You can pose your questions in the comment box. I will stop and ask you questions. If you have anything to write about the courses that are being taught, you can write them in the YouTube chat box and I will get them. So, this is a different kind of pedagogy we are gearing towards, we are moving towards, and this is again going to be temporary. Without further ado, let me go back to the text that I was having with you. That was Amitav Ghosh, The Shadow Lines. And as I remember, I talked briefly about the the fictional form that Amitav Ghosh uses while writing his novels. The Shadow Lines happens to be his first novel, his second novel, and the first being The Circle of Reason. If you read the entire repertoire of Amitav Ghosh, you find that Amitav Ghosh comes predominantly from a scientific background, and therefore, in Ghosh narrative, it's intrinsic that the ideas of storytelling, the ideas of research, the ideas of anthropological survey, all of them play a pivotal role. So, Ghosh deals with the narrative in a manner which is not very simplistic, which is quite hybrid, to be very honest. Why it's hybrid? Because in Ghosh narratives, you find the interface between fact and fiction, fiction and non fiction. If you read his recently published novel, The Gun Island, in 2019, you find how Ghosh's approach is predominantly anthropological, how he is giving out an anthropological history of, of a particular space. Or in his Ibis trilogy, how the thrust of Ghosh remains predominantly anthropological. In the Shadow Lines, in the first phase of Ghosh lives, Ghosh novels, Ghosh predominantly deals with the oral history of partition. The oral history of partition. We all know that there is a difference between history and historiography. While historiography is predominantly written and fundamentally structured around a narrative, history can be an alternative to that. History can offer an alternative to that. History can be Oral history can be unwritten, history can be unverified. So there are two modes of narration in historiography. At one level, you find the written, organized, structured historical narrative, the historical narrative that is based on the official documentation or that is based on the documentation by a historian, and also the historical narrative that is not documented, that is undocumented, that is unverified, that is untested. So there are two spaces of history that intersect at a point in Amitav Ghosh narratives. I remember I taught you Draupadi, and while doing Draupadi, I told you about the oral historiography, about the undocumented historiography, how individuals can exist beyond the ambit of history, how the individuals can remain without history, without the narrative of official history, without the narrative of the historical register the that the state wants to drill into your consciousness. So there are people who remain outside this historical threshold, historical boundary. And in Amitav Ghosh novels, you find people like them engulfing the narrative, people like them contouring the narrative. So they are the backbone, as if they are as if the big backbone of the narrative of Amitav Ghosh. And that's why in Ghosh narrative you find a series of contestation and negotiation between historical places, historical characters, and the shadowy places, and the places that exist in memory, in imagination, right? So, at one level, there is a historical genealogy, there is a historical time limit. At another level, you find there is a parallel existence of a spectral space that contests the historical narrative. In shadow lines, specifically, you find how the narrative will give vent to this shadowy existence. The shadowy existence, the shadowy sub narrative, the shadowy substructure that exists outside the threshold of the ur narrative, the principal narrative, the shadow and the quote unquote reality, how the reality will precede the shadow, how the reality will supersede the shadow, or how the shadow will come back and contest the reality. So it's a battle between the reality and the shadow that Amitav Ghosh will take you through in his narrative of the shadow lines. If we focus on the title of the novel, what does it imply? What does it indicate? That the word shadow presupposes the presence of a reality. The word shadow presupposes the presence of a original line against which the shadow is placed, right? So when you have the question of shadow paralleling with the original line, when you have the question of shadow existing with the original line, that means the shadow is falling on the original. When we talk about the question of veracity, authenticity, or reality, we tend to undermine the shadow. We just focus on the enlightened part of history. We are hardly bothered about the shadowy part of the history. Amitav Ghosh will bring to the foreground, Amitav Ghosh will lay bare the shadowy part of history which is often undermined in the original narrative. In Ghosh narratives, you find the characters who are marginalized in the history, who are marginalized in the official account or partition, will speak, will share their memories, will share their stories, will share their agonies. So that's how there will be an interface, there will be an interplay between stories, agonies, memories, and the shadowy past, which is often undocumented. We all have, every individual has a reservoir of memory where our past are usually buried, our past are inhumed. We do not get to know, we do not get to excavate those pasts which are buried within the narratives of our personal memory. Amitav Ghosh will let these personal voices come in to this official narrative of a novel. The novel will have a polyphony of many voices. And you all know the word polyphony is the word polyphony is derived from Mikhail Bakhtin. Mikhail Bakhtin. Bakhtin's idea of polyphony will come into play in the shadow lines. So the title, at one level, indicates the presence of a unilateral, of a unilinear line that is concrete, that is tangible, that is realizable. At another level, it will also talk about the presence of a shadowy existence that contests this official narrative of history. So the shadow and the reality will have an interface in Ghosh narration. That's why the title is The Shadow Lines, and there are multiple lines. So it's not only one document or one type of history that Ghosh is talking about. Rather, Ghosh is talking about a series of histories, a series of lines that are coming into interplay with each other, that are crisscrossing each other, that are intersecting each other. This intersectionality of the shadows makes the novel a very interesting read. It's a novel about memory, it's a novel about agony, it's a novel about traveling different spaces, it's a novel about love, it's a novel about sexuality, it's a novel about reminiscences. It's a novel about going down the memory lane with the forgotten characters of our past. So, when I read the novel for the first time, I had found some uncanny resemblances in this novel with my personal life, and each of you will find that, because we all have those exhumed memories, those memories which are not part of our daily existence, which we try to keep secretly in the recesses of our mind. We all have those memories. We all have those dark spots, mysterious spots. And we all have the shadow lines in our mind, which we often do not traverse, which we often do not have the audacity to confront. So, without further ado, let me dive into the text of Shadow Lines and I will gradually explain the ideas that I have discussed with you till now. Let me share the screen. Let me share the screen. Wait. So I hope you are being able to listen to me. You are being able to listen to this lecture. I hope you are not facing any problem. Any kind of problem, you can let me know if you find any sort of problem. I hope you can see my screen. If you can see my screen, please comment in the comment box. তোমরা যদি স্ক্রিন দেখতে পেয়ে থাকো একটু কমেন্ট করে দিও। পাচ্ছ না আই গেস এখন। Can you see my screen? Please comment. Can you see my screen? Yes or no? Okay, you can see the screen, right? So the first chapter is enlightened going away. So it's very symbolic that the novel begins with going away. That means it it locates itself in the past. It locates itself in the distant horizon, in the distant corridor of memory. So going away means going back in retrospection, going away from the contemporary time, going behind, দূরে চলে যাওয়া. Going away is it's a chronological shift in the narration. The novel begins with a chronological shift in the narration. It's happening, it's unfolding in retrospect. In retrospect, the memory is playing a pivotal role here. Wait a minute, I have a call to attend. Okay, it got disconnected. Okay, right. So, going away. In 1939, 13 years before I was born, my father's aunt, Maya Devi, went to England with her husband and her son, Trideep. It startled me to discover how readily the name comes off my pen as Maya Devi, for I have never spoken of her thus. Not allowed at any rate, as my grandfather's only sister, she was always Maya Takuma to me, but still, from as far back as I can remember, I have known her in the secrecy of my mind as Maya Devi, as though she were a well known stranger, like a film star or a politician whose picture I had seen in a newspaper. Perhaps it was merely because I knew her very little, for she was not often in Kolkata. That explanation seems likely enough, but I know it to be untrue. The truth is that I did not want to think of her as a relative. To have done that would have diminished her, and her family, I could bring myself to believe that their worth in my eyes could be reduced to something so arbitrary and unimportant as a blood relationship. Right. So you find the novel is being written in 1988, and the chronological shift takes the novel back to 1939, 13 years before his birth, 13 years before the birth of the narrator. You will find in this novel the narrator is an unnamed narrator. The narrator will only posit himself chronologically. The narrator will only posit himself chronologically or herself chronologically. It's a chronology, and the narrator will be measured only in terms of the chronological account he or she occupies. The narrator's identity will never be revealed, but the narrator will move through in spaces and in time. In 1939, 13 years before I was born, my father's aunt Maya Devi went to England with her husband and her son Trideep. So we get the account of Maya Devi, and very strangely enough, the word Maya Devi has an uncanny resemblance with the word the shadow lines. So Maya Devi seems to be part of the shadowy zone of the narrator's memory, which he is or she is unraveling through this narrative. In 1939, 13 years before I was born, my father's aunt Maya Devi went to England with her husband and her son Trideep. So Maya Devi associates for the narrator an objective correlative, a reservoir of memories, a reservoir of impressions that are perhaps irreducible to the blood relationship. See this line? I could not bring myself to believe that their worth in my eyes could be reduced to something so arbitrary and unimportant as a blood relationship. It startles me now to discover how readily the name comes off my pain as Maya Devi, for I have never spoken of her thus, not aloud, not at any rate. As my grandfather's only sister, she was always Maya Thakuma to me. She was always Maya Thakuma. So the way familial relationship fixes identity to characters, and the narrator's urge for going beyond that particularized identity of Maya Thamma to recognize her as Maya Devi, as a woman of independent spirit. So the shift from Thakuma to Devi is a very interesting one. And why this shift is taking place, we will get to know as we read the novel. So, this shift from Maya Thakuma and Maya Devi will have an interesting impact on the development of the narrative. You all know that the identity of mother or grandmother fixes the role of a woman to a particular gender attribute, that the space of a grandmother or the space of a mother is a hallowed space. And often the space of motherhood, grandmother is also a space of motherhood. The space of motherhood often undermines their achievement as women. If you remember, Charles Lamb's Dream Children Are Reverie, and where Charles Lamb remembers the grandmother, and how she was a dancer. And when you talk about woman in terms of gender role, that reduces the identity or the essence of a woman to this gender role. But when you talk about the woman in her essential name, in her essential attribute, like Maya Devi, that means you are recognizing the woman even outside the fold of this family relationship. Woman could not be those women could not be confined or domesticated within the familial ties of motherhood or, or blood relationship. They far exceeded that. And that's why Maya Devi seems to be more attractive for the narrator rather than Maya Thakuma. As Maya Devi, as though she were a well known stranger, like a film star or a politician whose picture I had seen in a newspaper. So Maya Devi had a strange kind of an aura, the aura that a politician or a film star used to have. Perhaps it was merely because I knew her very little, for she was not often in Kolkata. That explanation seems likely enough, but I know it to be untrue. The young narrator knows that Maya Thakuma or Maya Devi had something intrinsic to her that could that could provide her that self sufficient grandeur that is missing from an ordinary woman. The truth that I did not want to think of her as a relative to have done that would have diminished her and her family. I could not bring myself to believe that their worth in my eyes could be reduced to something so arbitrary and unimportant as a blood relationship. Maya Devi was 29 when they left, and Trideep was 8. So, as I was talking about, the identity of the narrator, the identity of Maya Devi, and the identity of Trideep, all three of them are located chronologically. Maya Devi was 29 when they left, and Trideep was 8. And এখানে যদি আমরা চলে যাই, in 1939, 13 years before I was born, my father's aunt Maya Devi went to England with her husband Trideep. That means when Trideep was born, Maya Devi was just 21, and as Trideep was 8 and Maya Devi's age was 29, and 1939, 13 years before the birth of the narrator, they had gone to England. So it's talking about the pre independence period, the period that precedes 1947, the period of intense political turmoil in India. Over the years, although I cannot remember when it happened any more than I can remember, when I first learned to tell the time or tie my shoelaces, I have come to believe that I was 8 too when Pradeep first talked to me about the journey. I remember trying very hard to imagine him back to my age. So, very clearly, the narrator, through this narrative, develops an uncanny affinity with Tridib. Tridib is a figure that the narrator places himself against. The narrator locates himself with. Tridip will be the 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 bright absentee, the clock, the yardstick, the chronological yardstick through which the narrator will mediate his position in the novel. So Tridip will be offering the narrator that ideal, quote unquote, idealized yardstick through which he will measure his position. So there is at one level the ideational space that Tridip, Mayadevi, and Mayadevi's husband, all of them occupy, and also there is the real space in which the narrator exists. So this interplay between the real and the ideational will take our focus on the shadowy aspect of reality, the reality that will be mediated by the shadowy presence, the reality that will be that will be preceded by a shadow, a shadow of memory which is unrecognized, which is unheard, which is unexpressed. And this novel will be a novel of exploration of those shadows, of those memories, of those agonies, of partition, of going away, of coming back. So this is all for today. আমি আজকে একটু ছোট ক্লাস নিলাম, since this is the beginning, and from today onwards I will take one class every day. প্রত্যেক দিন আমি একটা করে ক্লাস নেব, even on Sunday. So forgive me for that. I gave you a break for 2 weeks as I was not in a very mentally stable state after going through that horrid phase of reality. So many students are still getting infections, so many colleagues are falling ill. So, in this situation, it's perhaps a luxury to continue our online classes, but we have our exams around the corner in August, perhaps. So we have to continue this online teaching. We have to do this, and I will do these classes every day if I do not fall sick or fall ill. Thank you for joining. If you have any questions, you can send your queries, send your questions in the comment box or in the WhatsApp chat. I will try to answer them. So my classes will not be very long classes because it puts enormous amount of stress on my voice to speak at a go for 1 hour. That's why I will keep my classes from tomorrow onwards within the span of 40 to 45 minutes, and I will give you some time for question answers. Thank you for listening. Today I have taken a class of 35 minutes as today is the first class of our YouTube session. Hope you have enjoyed. You can subscribe to my channel. You can listen to my channel, but please don't share these lectures outside the WhatsApp group, outside the college group that you have. Right. So thank you for joining. If you have any doubts, any questions, any areas, any comments that need further clarification, you can put them in the comment box or you can ask me directly via WhatsApp. Thank you so much for joining.